Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Did you know that even everyday objects like wine or drums might be silently shaping our opinions about entire groups of people? It sounds wild, but this paper dives deep into that exact idea. So, what are stereotypes really made of? We usually think of them as direct links between a social group, like women or men, and certain traits, like caring or decisive. But what if there is a whole hidden network of associations, connecting these groups to seemingly random things like wine, beer, harps, or drums? This study explores that idea, wondering if these everyday object connections actually play a big role in how we form and even change our stereotypes. The big question here is whether changing these object associations can actually change our perceptions of social groups. Imagine someone asks you to describe women. You might think of traits like kindness or nurturing. But what if they ask if women were a beverage, what would they be? You might immediately say wine. And if they asked about men, maybe beer. This study took that idea and ran with it. They wanted to see if these object associations, like women to wine or men to beer, actually carry the same kind of meaning as the traditional traits we associate with them. The researchers hypothesized that these object associations aren't just random, they actually reflect and even influence our stereotypical views. They believe these object networks are like a hidden architecture of stereotypes, always there, but often unnoticed. And the really exciting part is their idea that by changing these object links, we might be able to change people's perceptions of social groups, at least for a while. To start, they needed to map out these networks. The first study, called Mapping Stereotypes, was all about collecting these associations. They asked a bunch of people to answer questions like, if X were a Y, what would it be? Where X was a social group and Y was something from a different category, like a beverage, a musical instrument, or a color. They asked people to do this for 100 different social groups, covering things like race, gender, age, and occupation across 8 different types of everyday items. Think of it like building a giant web. On one side, you have groups like women or rich people. On the other side, you have categories like musical instruments or beverages. People would then fill in the connections, for example, linking women to harp or wine, and rich people to champagne or Porsches. They collected thousands of these associations. After collecting all these responses, they looked at the connections. They found that people did indeed associate social groups with specific everyday objects, and these associations weren't totally random groups. That were seen as similar often had similar clusters of object associations. For instance, different immigrant groups from similar regions clustered together based on the objects associated with them. This suggested that these objects carried meaningful information about the groups. But the truly key finding here was whether these objects actually reflected the stereotypical traits like warmth and competence that people associate with those groups. To figure this out, they used a powerful AI tool called a large language model, or LLM, to rate how warm and competent different objects were perceived to be. They found a strong connection. Objects linked to groups tended to have similar warmth and competence ratings as the groups themselves. So objects associated with high-power groups might be rated as competent, while objects linked to low-power groups were rated as less competent. This meant that the everyday objects weren't just random decorations. They seemed to carry the evaluative meanings of the social groups they were linked with. The study showed that these object associations were broadly distributed, meaning even less common associations between a group and an object could still carry stereotypical information. This was a huge step in showing that stereotypes are more complex than just simple group trait links. Now, the really exciting part. If these object associations are part of social stereotypes, can we actually change stereotypes by changing the objects associated with a group? That is what Study 2, Editing Stereotypes, set out to test. They took the networks they built in Study 1 and tweaked them. They created 3 different conditions. In the first, the network intervention, they intentionally linked a target group like women, or Muslims, or liberals, to objects that were strongly associated with another group known for high competence or high warmth. For example, they might link women to objects typically associated with athletes, like cheetahs or fast cars, to try and boost perceptions of physical strength. Then they had a stereotype control group, which kept some of the original stereotypical associations, but swapped out just 1 or 2 highly salient ones. Finally, they had a random control group, where they swapped in random objects, not necessarily linked to competence or warmth, just to see if any change in associated objects had an effect. After participants were exposed to these modified association statements, like if women were a beverage, they would be Gatorade. Instead of the typical wine, they were asked to explain why that connection might make sense. Then, importantly, they were asked to list 5 adjectives that came to mind when thinking about the target group. The researchers were looking to see if the interventions changed the traits people described afterwards. And guess what? It worked. The groups that received the network intervention, where they were linked to objects from high warmth or high competence groups, were described with more positive evaluative traits compared to the control groups. For instance, when women were linked to athlete-associated objects, participants were more likely to describe them as stronger. Muslims, when linked to nurse-associated items that convey warmth, were described as warmer. This is crucial because in these interventions, they never explicitly mentioned traits like strong or warm. Participants had to infer these traits themselves by making sense of the group-object connections. This suggests that by simply changing the everyday objects associated with a group, they could causally shift how people perceive that group's warmth and competence. Interestingly, how people made sense of these new associations mattered. The study found that using analogical reasoning, thinking about abstract similarities between the group and the object, was much more effective than just associative reasoning, thinking about simple co-occurrences, for example. Saying Pacific Islanders are like champagne because both represent prestige and celebration. Analogical led to stronger shifts in perceived competence than saying Pacific Islanders drink champagne at parties. Associatives. It seems that when people engage in deeper, structural thinking, they are more open to reinterpreting a group. However, there was a bit of a nuance. While participants' written justifications showed these shifts in perceived warmth and competence, the explicit list of 5 adjectives they generated afterwards showed only minor changes. This suggests that while the intervention could temporarily influence how people reasoned about the group in the moment, it didn't necessarily lead to lasting or immediate changes in their easily recalled trait descriptions. So, what does this all mean? This research paints a picture of stereotypes as a much more complex and distributed system than we often realize. It is not just about group trait links, but a vast web of associations connecting social groups to everyday objects. These objects, in turn, seem to carry the evaluative weight of the groups they're linked to. The study demonstrates that these hidden architectures of stereotypes are real, and that by strategically editing these networks, we can actually cause temporary shifts in people's perceptions of social groups. The fact that they could do this without ever mentioning specific traits, just by changing object associations, is pretty remarkable. It hints that to truly change stereotypes, we might need to think beyond just correcting prejudiced ideas and instead focus on re-engineering the cultural landscape around those groups. This research really pushes the boundaries of how we understand concept formation and change. It shows that even seemingly random connections can become a basis for reasoning and evaluation. It suggests that people are quite adept at constructing analogies, even from unexpected sources, which can then reshape abstract social categories. The authors also point out some interesting limitations and future directions. One of the big ones is that the changes in explicit adjective lists were minimal. This means future research could explore more subtle or implicit ways to measure stereotype change. Another thought is about the long-term effects. Do these object associations permanently alter our views? Or do the meanings of the objects themselves shift over time to accommodate their new associations? It's like asking if linking women to competent objects will permanently make us see women as more competent, or if competent will start to feel more feminine. These are fascinating questions about how meanings evolve. In the end, this study gives us a much richer understanding of stereotypes. They're not just simple beliefs, but dynamic distributed networks. By understanding and even manipulating this hidden architecture of everyday object associations, we might be able to develop more effective ways to combat prejudice and promote more accurate, fair views of social groups. It's a reminder that the world around us, even the objects we encounter daily, can silently influence how we see others. What do you guys think about this idea of a hidden stereotype network? Does it change how you look at everyday objects? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this breakdown helpful, give it a thumbs up and subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more science insights. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.